Welcome to Talking Personal Wealth Management podcast. My name is Leah Crowley, and in this series we're taking a look at a range of topics that you might know a little bit about but want to get a better understanding of. We explore all areas of personal wealth management, including investing, estate planning, financial advisory, self-managed super funds, insurance, and financial life cycles. And today we're joined by Peter Bembrick, a partner in Mann, Judd's tax division. We're talking about family trust. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Leah. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. So what about a bit of a background? How long have you been at Mann, Judd?
I've been with the firm 32 years.
Nice.
Started out of school.
Straight out of school?
Yep.
Whilst you were at uni? Or?
Yep, started a cadetship and then studied part-time and while working at HLB.
Yeah, fantastic. And you haven't looked back since?
No, that's right.
So you must know a fair bit about family trust, so I guess you're the perfect person to ask this broad yet I'm sure involved question. What is a family trust and how does it work?
Yeah, as you say, that is a very big question, but it's an important topic. So just broadly, a trust it's an entity where assets are legally held by someone, which is the trustee, on behalf of someone else who are the beneficiaries. So, and a family trust are a very common type of trust, usually what we will call to as a discretionary or non-fixed trust. And that's where the beneficiaries are a group of individuals and related entities from the same family.
Mm-hmm.
So your question about the second part of your question, how does it work?
Yeah.
And there's a few points I could sort of make there about how does it work. So every year the trustee needs to decide how to allocate the income of the trust, typically on a discretionary basis and in any proportion. So and that can change from year to year. So one thing that means is that simply being a beneficiary of the trust doesn't give you a right to receive a particular amount or percentage or even any distribution.
So sometimes you might
receive nothing.
Yeah, right.
And so it's up to the trustee to decide that. And the trustee, in terms of that role, they can be one or more individuals,
mm-hmm.
or often it'll be a company that's appointed as the trustee, in which case it's the directors of the trustee that makes that decision about allocating of trust income.
So the trustee, you're saying often it's an outside.
Well, actually, not from in your typical family trust. It's usually the family. So
mm-hmm.
it can be, in most cases, you'll find it's a company which, say, mum and dad will hold the shares in that company and be the directors of that company. So it is very much within the family, your typical family trust. And there are other situations. There may be situations where you get an outsider in, but that's not your common scenario because it's something that very much is controlled within the family.
Yeah,
and
right.
And some of the other roles, just to probably expand on that, some of the other roles that you have the way that a trust is established is you have a settler, and that is an independent person usually. So there's a whole lot of intricacies of trust law where the settler is the one who creates the trust,
mm-hmm.
And typically
sets it all up
and actually puts in. It will often be a nominal sum like $10 or $100 to establish the trust.
Okay.
And that would generally be somebody who's independent. Often it might be the accountant or the solicitor for the family who does that, establishes that, and therefore they won't be a trustee or a beneficiary because you sort of can't set something up. It's then being held for yourself. It's sort of there's some legalities in that. So that's the way it's typically done. And then you'll have a trust deed, and that's an extremely important document which will govern what happens within the trust,
mm-hmm.
Gives the trustee the powers, says what they can and can't do, and typically the deed will name an appointer, it could be one or more person, and the appointer is somebody who has the control, has the power to, under the deed, to appoint or remove a trustee. So a trustee isn't just, you don't put a trustee in and that's in place for forever. There can be provisions like if the trustee dies, somebody could take their place. That can be set up in the deed, but also the appointer can actually remove someone and appoint a new trustee. So the appointer, and again, that would typically be perhaps the main individual in the family who has that. There can be more than one having joint powers, but there would be at least one trustee, one appointer, in that situation. So I don't know, this is a fairly long answer to the first question, but it probably sets up some of the key concepts.
Yeah, just giving us a bit of an overview.
That we need to cover. Because another thing is that there's which is very important to understand, is that trusts are governed by state law as opposed to federal law. So in every state apart from South Australia, there is a maximum life of a trust. So, for example, in New South Wales, the trust can't go for more than 80 years. So unless the deed may actually specify a shorter period. So there's a lot of deeds that were set up in the 70s that specify 40 years. So suddenly that 40 years became up. Unless you read the deed, you wouldn't know that. But a lot of them there's a lot of trusts around that have got an 80-year life. So at some point they will come to the end of their life. And what happens then is the trust will vest. So it will automatically end, and there will be something in the deed which will say that when the trust vests, all the assets go to this person, and that's, you may not want that to happen because that'll have tax consequences. So there could be some planning that's needed when the trust is coming to the end of its life. So that just, I guess, illustrates one of the basic rules of sort of rule number one of dealing with a trust is read the deed and make sure you've got a copy of the deed, which is often a problem. Can't find a copy, but you need to have a copy of the deed and know what's in it in order to operate the trust properly.
How common are family trusts in Australia?
Well, very common, I'd say. And one statistic I've read is that 2017 there was an estimate of more than 800,000 trusts.
That's a lot.
I'm not sure they're all family trusts, but an awful lot of those would be family trusts.
So when you say you're not sure all of them would be family trusts, what would other examples of other trusts be?
Well, without getting too detailed, there are other types of trusts. There can be, a common type of trust that you'll have is a managed fund.
Oh,
so So without getting into, you can have a unit trust. So a common type of unit trust would be particularly to hold property. Someone might set up a unit trust to hold property. But again, without getting too much into those, which is not really the subject of what we're talking about here, and managed funds are another type of trust. So I'm not sure whether those statistics included that number or not. But you can be fairly comfortable that a lot of those 800,000, and there were probably, that was, 5 years ago, so there were probably a lot more because we in that time I'd say our firm set up quite a few.
Yeah, right.
So there's a lot of trusts out there and a lot of family trusts out there, and they're used by a wide variety of people. So that would include SME business owners. You could actually use a trust to operate a business, or you could have a company that runs a business and then the shares in that company could be owned by a family trust. So there's different structures, ways that a family trust can be used in a business structure. They can also be used as investment vehicles to build up a family's wealth for the current and future generations. So it's again a very flexible, and I know we're going to talk about some of the benefits and the ways that trust can be used, but that's certainly,
it sounds flexible and long term.
Yeah, that's the idea, and it's obviously but on the other hand, it's different to a super fund has a particular purpose and has obviously certain timeframes. Whereas the thing about one of the flexibilities of family trusts is they don't have the same restrictions of family. So often a family they'll be putting money into superannuation for the longer term for retirement, and then family trusts, as you say, they could have a long-term investment horizon, but they could also have a relatively short-term. They could be either, and so most family trusts are relatively small, and I just thought it was just worth one notable exception, which has been in the news over the last few years, is the Hope Margaret Hancock Trust, which you might be aware of, which has $5 billion of assets, which is...
Are you saying that's not a normal...
That's not your typical family trust, and that's, of course, the reason that's been in the news is because it was the subject of a dispute between Gina Reinhardt, sole trustee, and her four children over the control of that trust. Yeah. And so that is actually the same type of trust that we're talking about, but obviously on a much bigger scale than what most people are looking at.
That obviously would have had at some point in time, I'm guessing, at least 3 generations of family in that trust. Potentially?
That's right. In the sense that Lang Hancock, Gina's father, was where the wealth came from. He's established that trust in the name of his late wife, and appointed Gina as the trustee of that trust, but with the intention that it benefit his grandchildren, her children. So there's your 3 generations.
That's the
in
3 generations.
Yeah, but it can have really, there's no set limit on the generations. Typically any trust would have at least 2 generations probably active, being parents would set up a trust with the intention that their children and be the beneficiaries and possibly grandchildren. So there could often be 3 generations. It depends really on the ages of the children, but there's no real limit because the class of beneficiaries in a typical family trust deed is defined very broadly. So what would typically happen is that there would be primary beneficiaries or named beneficiaries, which might be, say, mum and dad, and the class of beneficiaries would include all of their family members, spouses of any eligible beneficiary, and related entities. So it's pretty broad.
When you're talking about spouses, I'm just trying to think of people who potentially could leave a family trust. If there's a marriage breakup, a spouse would leave a family trust?
Exactly right. Yes, exactly right. So in terms of is it when would someone leave a trust? That's exactly where you've read my mind there. That's exactly the example where you would think that somebody would leave, because it's likely that would be defined in the way that if someone's come into the family group by marriage, they're only going, or by relationship. I guess we don't have to define it to confine it to marriage as such. But if they're not, they're only in the group as long as that relationship continues. So if it breaks down and they're no longer in that relationship, then they would probably automatically lose that eligibility, I suppose.
Yeah, right. And because a lot of trusts can be, is it a maximum of 80 years that a trust would?
In terms of the New South Wales rules, and I don't think any other states have any longer periods apart from South Australia that changed their law so that there is actually no time limit for South Australia.
Yeah, right. You could potentially only be looking at a 3-generation trust anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Or no, it's hard to see too many more.
Yeah.
And so then that's right. So it'll play itself out.
Yeah.
And whether there's practicalities there too as to whether in fact it's, as depending on the type of assets and the situation within a family, it may not be practical to keep family assets pooled, or they may not, no matter how well they get on, and often they don't, but no matter how well all the generations get on, they may just not want to have their assets pooled in that way. So, and it's probably important in that respect to bear in mind, this is where it sort of crosses over a little bit into estate planning, and that a family trust is not the type of asset that forms part of someone's estate. So if, you've got assets that you've essentially put into a family trust, those assets stay in the trust and they'll pass on. You'll effectively pass control to the next generation through changing the trustee or through them taking over the trustee company or something, but you won't necessarily, the assets themselves won't be affected by the way someone's will's drafted. So, but there's still got to be some thought as to how, in terms of the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's all still connected, isn't it?
You've got to look at, if you're doing your estate planning, you've also got to look at, well, what have we got in family trusts, and what's when I die, or when with the 2 parents when we both pass away, what happens with the assets of that trust, and what's the picture, and that's a lot of that. There's a lot of planning in something like that.
Yeah, I bet.
And especially if the asset, it may well be that, as I said before, the assets of a trust could, a key asset of a trust could be the shares in a business, in a company that own the business, and that business could be worth quite a bit. So therefore, or there could be properties, and it's always very difficult if you're trying to divide assets and you want, say, 1 or 2 children to take over the business and someone else to get the properties, and getting that, that's all very difficult. So how family trusts fit into that is quite tricky sometimes.
You've mentioned trustee a few times and, had a bit of an overview at the beginning, but what is the role of a trustee within a family trust? I
did touch on the fact that, as you say, that one of the key roles is to distribute income. So someone's got to make that decision to, because it's a discretionary trust. So if it was a unit trust and it was fixed, then it would be like having shares in a company. It's whatever percentage you have, that's how much income you get. But generally the trustee has to pass a resolution, usually in June every year, to determine how much income goes to which beneficiaries, or which beneficiaries will get distributions and in what proportion, or what amount of distributions, that sort of thing. So that's an important power. Legally, the trustee actually, as I mentioned at the start, actually is the owner of the asset. So a trust can't be the legal owner of an asset, but the trustee is the legal owner. Yeah. Okay. Likewise, a trust in itself, although we think of it as an entity, can't actually incur liabilities or have. So it's the trustee that incurs the liabilities So if it's a trading trust, there's all sorts of liabilities that arise in a business, or it could be borrowing money to buy assets, so then the trustee has to take on that liability, but then they have an indemnity under the deed to recover any liability against trust assets. So there's a certain level of protection there, sort of for the trustee, but you're certainly taking on that risk on behalf of the trust.
Risk and responsibility seems like
there is a bit there.
lot.
Yeah, that's right, and that is one reason why a company perhaps is sometimes used as well, because if a $2 company is the trustee and there is a deficiency of trust assets, a bank might say, or another creditor might say, well, okay, we're going to look to the trustee for repayment of that liability, and the trustee is a $2 company, which they can't go any further unless the directors of that company have done something, I guess, untoward, and they go after the directors, which is a whole other sort of thing. But assuming everything's sort of above board and there just aren't enough assets to repay the debt, then that's it. I mean, that's getting into areas of insolvency, which is certainly not my specialty. But, But that's the sort of some of the practicalities of why this is done that way.
In terms of benefits of having a family trust, it sounds like it could potentially be a lot of work, but it certainly sets younger generations up. Is that the main benefit? What's the older generation within a family trust? What's the benefit that they're receiving?
Sure. Some of the key benefits we always talk about, asset protection is always a key one. So if you put something in a trust, there's certainly a lot of protection from business risks and other sort of risks that somebody might incur, as opposed to holding assets themselves. Now, having them in a company can also provide an element of protection from that as well. But then you add to that the flexibility of a discretionary trust compared to, say, a company. And flexibility of income distributions and just generally operating the trust, that they're sort of part of it. When you talk about asset protection, I mean that does only go so far. One of the common things that will be cited will be with divorce and family breakdowns, relationship breakdowns. They're probably one of the broad, as you'd expect. That's probably one of the family law. Is probably has one of the broadest powers. So you're much less likely to overcome family law settlement or claims or whatever by having a structure like this. But for normal commercial purposes, it certainly helps. But as I said, that flexibility. Another slightly more technical point is with there are very generous capital gains tax concessions on selling a small business. So that's another topic, and I could talk about that for a whole other podcast on the small business.
Or I might get you back then,
because they're very worthwhile concessions. But the flexibility again, and the way those rules work, mean that sometimes using a discretionary trust can make those rules easier to satisfy. So that's another consideration in setting up a business structure.
And what about tax benefits? There
are clearly tax benefits, and that's certainly what is often discussed, and they're often seen as a tax dodge, or that's why the only reason. And a lot of people would argue, and certainly a lot of advisors would argue that there are those other considerations that we mentioned for setting up trust structures, but there's no doubt that there can be some tax advantages of distributing to lower rate beneficiaries, either to individuals with lower income, like say a non-working spouse, or to a company with a lower tax rate than an individual. Whereas if anything goes to an individual, once they get above 180,000, they're paying 47%, including Medicare levy, whereas at a company tax rates of 30% or 25%, down to 25% for a small business. So that there's some certainly benefits there.
Yeah.
There has been some recent ATO action in the area of distributing income through trusts, which has generated a lot of publicity, and that will, particularly around distributing to adult children or retired parents is another one. So you might have the generation that's working and operating a business, and their parents might be retired without much income because they're getting a tax-free pension out of their super fund. So they've got capacity to then receive trust distributions at a low tax rate. So it can actually go up.
Right. Okay.
It can actually go up and down the generations.
Yeah, right.
Distributing to anyone below 18 is generally not tax effective because they're taxed at a higher rate. So except in their you asked before about types of trusts. There's another type of trust called a testamentary trust, which again is that's to do with estate planning, and that would be a trust that comes out of a will. Probably a different topic than what we're discussing now. But if something's set up as a testamentary trust, then that means that income can be distributed tax effectively to beneficiaries under 18, because it's sort of the whole point of a testamentary trust is to set up for say grandchildren or the next generation. But
the family trust do not allow for that.
That's right. So a trust that's set up in the ordinary course of the type of thing we're talking about doesn't get that benefit.
Okay.
So we're really talking. So that's where within certain classes of people there are tax benefits, but the ATO has been looking at that very recently, and so it's very much still under consultation as we speak now. So it's something that will need to be considered going forward. But traditionally, there have been some tax planning opportunities of people that have looked at, and again, it's still there within certain parameters. So
the tax is pretty high if minors to get money from a family trust. So does that then answer my question that I wanted to ask, which was, can family members under the age of 18 be part of a family trust?
Yeah, well, yes, they will fall within the definition of beneficiaries. So because the deed doesn't need to define each beneficiary. So when a child is born into a family, or someone marries into a family, that you don't need to go and amend the deed to add them. Typically, they'll meet the definition automatically. But it's more the tax law that then applies a higher tax rate to someone under 18. There's an amount of $416, which has been that's been the number since probably the 80s. So it's not one of those thresholds that's indexed. So anything up to 416 can be distributed tax free to a minor. So you'll find that a lot of trustees will actually distribute $416 to every child in the family, but no more. And that can be done, and the ATO doesn't have an issue with that. Okay. That's what the law allows.
But still, like if you're 8 years old and you get $416, you feel like you're rich, right?
Well, that's if you get it. I don't think you'll be seeing that. I don't think you'll be I don't think my son knows that he's getting that. But that's how they fit in, but then they'll turn 18, and then it changes, and then there's a whole lot of things to consider there.
Sure.
Thing is, you may want them to benefit. I mean, what the ATO is concerned about is situations where they're being used as a beneficiary, but they're really not getting the benefit of the money. So, a lot of families will actually want their children to be beneficiaries. They'll want them to see this money in time. So for having them fall within the trust, the scope of beneficiaries from the beginning, or from when they're born, will mean that later on they will be able to benefit from the trust.
We're about to delve into a question that may be too big for this particular episode, so maybe it'll have to be an episode in itself because it's a pretty big topic. But what is the family trust election, the FTE?
Sure, yeah, Leah. Well, that as you say, it is quite a technical area, but it can be summarised fairly simply in a way. It's purely, unlike some of the other things we've been talking about, which are all about trust law, and that trust law comes from English law. So I mean, it goes back centuries. A lot of the things we've been talking about, the family trust election rules are specifically introduced to the Australian tax legislation, so they're quite specific. Only for that purpose. And what they broadly allow is, they deal with mainly two things: trust losses. When a trust makes a loss, there are specific rules around company losses and how they can be recouped within a company. So this is sort of in effect, an equivalent to say, well, when can a trust recoup its losses? And they're trying to make sure that it does it in an appropriate way. It's the trust loss rules themselves are fairly complex, but what the family trust election tries to do is, for a family trust, simplify things to a certain extent and say, well, we've got this whole group of fairly complex tests, but if this is all within one family, and clearly there's no outsiders coming in here, this is all just one family's operations, we'll allow, and you make a family trust election that limits any distributions to within a particular family, then you do that and operate the trust that way, then you'll be allowed to use any losses within the trust. That's right. And then that's enforced by applying some penalty. They call it family trust distribution tax. So there'll be a penalty rate of tax, a bit like with minors getting distributions. You would never, in reality, if you've made a family trust election, you would never distribute to someone outside the family because you'll pay a high rate of tax.
Mm-hmm.
But in a practical sense, there's no actual, the family trust is not set up for anybody else. So in practice, I don't see that as being too much of a problem because it's only ever intended to operate within a family. So as long as they're within that family group, which it's a reasonably broad definition, then it works. And so then the losses can be used within the trust. On the same token, the second one is franking credits within trusts. They're typically that's where the trust is receiving franked dividends either from holding portfolios of shares or managed funds or something as an investment trust, or, as I mentioned a couple of times, where that trust actually owns the shares in an operating business. Then the way that the family gets profits out of the business is to have the company pay dividend to the trust, and then the trust distributes out to the family members. If the trust hasn't made that family trust election, then the beneficiaries effectively can't use the franking credits. So in practical terms, it has to make the election. But as long as it does that, which again, as I said, I don't see in most cases it being really that restrictive a thing to do, then it's just one of those things, procedural things that you have to make sure it's done. And as long as it's done and recorded on the tax return and the relevant paperwork has been completed, then all those franking credits that flow through the trust, because often the trust is a flow-through vehicle. So in practical terms, so any income that flows through the trust with franking credits will go to the beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries use the franking credits. So that's essentially what family trust elections are about. And then it's just one of those things that you just need to be aware of and make sure it happens.
Man, there's so much involved in a family trust. It's amazing, but I feel like I've gotten a broader and better understanding of what is involved and why they exist as well. So, Peter, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with us today. I'm sure if anybody wants more information, they can just get in contact, hlb.com.au.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I appreciate your time.
Perfect, you too, thanks. Peter Bembrick's expertise and knowledge is part of HLB Mann Judd's personal wealth management services. For more information, please visit our website hlb.com.au.